Yes, indeed, there's been a number of allusions to Znameny Raspiev, Orthodoxy, and the spiritual nature of Oestvolskaja's music already, for which I must thank the other speakers for giving me such a preface. It must be said that I have been slightly worried at times that too much would already be said, and thus there'd be little point of me being here. But luckily, well, at least I hope I have a few more things to say about the issue and take up where other speakers left off. So my paper is entitled An Esoteric Iconography, Orthodox and Devotion in the World of Galina Ustvolskaya. Excuse me. It was perhaps Galina Ustvolskaja's completion of Duet for Violin and Piano in 1964 that saw a major turning point in her musical style and personal aesthetic. This piece stripped away all the rhapsodic melodic material that was present in her violin and piano sonata of a decade earlier, an easy piece for comparison, and introduced a severity, even brutality, that would define her music from here on. For even both the time signature and key signature, Ustvolskaya gave herself a blank canvas upon which to work, removing all vestiges of conventional canonic writing. The dark intensity of the piece conveys the beginnings of Ustvolskaja's apocalyptic view and later preoccupation with, in her mindset, the hopeless state of humankind. Ustvolskaja's spiritual partialities and the myth that surrounds have received international fascination. They are, after all, startlingly obvious throughout all of her later works. As a response to this paper will aim to identify and examine Ustvolskaja's inclusion of elements of the spiritual, the mystical and iconographical, by examining the reverberations of liturgical practice in her deployed musical material. At first it may seem a little incongruous that the overriding spiritual element of Ustvolskaja's music was accomplished in the Soviet Union, a state where, of course, religious practice was so ferociously negated and restricted. An attempt to obliterate religion was largely successful, following the militaristic ideology of the Bolsheviks, the harsh suppression of religious practice by Stalin, and a fierce anti-religious campaign by Khrushchev. However, from the mid-1960s, Russian composers were no longer simply experimenting with ideas associated with the avant-garde. There was a revival of a spiritual heritage, where composers could retrace their cultural and religious roots, fooled by a response to the restrictions of the previous half-century. In addition, it seems Ustvolskaya sought spiritual comfort from the marginalized existence in which she felt forced to retreat. Ustvolskaya said she did not practice any particular religion and did not refer in her personal life directly to a Christian God, but did acknowledge a superior existence that has ultimate knowledge and control of the world to come. Her musical petition for forgiveness, coupled with her portrayal of this higher power as a punishing judge, does have huge reverberations in the Russian Orthodox Church. Participation in the Church's ancient practice and theology provided an oppressed Russian people not only with spiritual freedom, but also with a vessel to protest against the Soviet authorities' attempt to ideologically control them. It must be noted that Russian Orthodoxy thus became a representation of nation. People looked to the Church as a symbol of their national identity rather than to the state. Composing spiritual music enabled Ustvolskaya thus to break from the state, explore her own freedom of thought, protest against the ideological control imposed on her, identify with her nation, and find spiritual refuge during such a socially and spiritually devastating era. Perhaps the most important aspect of this is its consequence on her music. Ustvolskaja's music is thrust into an iconic existence, theatrically inviting the audience to experience it as direct communication with God. Although Ustvolskaja's compositions are undoubtedly elevated as a spiritual experience, it must be noted that they were not composed to fulfill any specific liturgical or religious function. But Ustvolskaja's music was not written as concert music either, but rather as an integral part of her own spiritual being. It is with this in mind that it is appropriate to reflect on Ustvolskaja's music as it transcends the physicality of sonic experience. It is difficult difficult to distinguish between the conveyance of the mystic and the religious in any musical language, an issue that Ivan Moody, composer of liturgical chant and ordained Orthodox priest himself, comprehensively explores in his article, The Mind and Heart, Mysticism and Music in the Experience of Contemporary Orthodox Composers, by positioning music as a vehicle to a mystical experience, aligning its mystical qualities to those of a religious icon. For an Orthodox Christian, an icon presents itself as a holy existence to be venerated. Moody is only one example of an Orthodox liturgical composer who affirmatively believes in this mystical aptitude of music. He writes, "Orthodoxy speaks of the mind entering the heart. This is the condition for real prayer, and this must be, at least partially, what is required for the composition of sacred music. This combination of the spiritual intensity of the heart and the mind is largely what not only epitomizes Russian sacred music writing, but provides the basis for the Orthodox mentality. Indeed, as Moody points out, Orthodox monks incline their heads towards their hearts when they pray, as if praying is no longer an occupation of the mind." This resonates further as the concept of the iconostasis, as you can see in the picture, is considered. Any understanding of the iconostasis can be encapsulated as the boundary between one world and the next. As a response to the human frailty recognized by the Orthodox, the Church created visual, material strength to compensate for this inevitable short-sightedness. The icons in the iconostasis function as a window between this world and the heavenly realm, bestowing a route through which human frailty can bear witness before God. Paweł Florensky summarizes thus. "Thus a window is a window because a region of light opens out beyond it. Hence the window giving us this light is not itself like the light, nor is it subjectively linked in our imagination with our ideas of light. But the window is that very light itself. In its ontological self-identity, that very light which, undivided in itself and thus inseparable from the sun, is streaming down from the heavens. But the window all by itself, i.e. apart from its relationship to the light, beyond its function as a carrier of light, is no longer a window, but dead wood and mere glass. Of course, initially, the most obvious icons that will spring to mind will be the luminant icon paintings and engravings found on the walls on every Orthodox church. However, according to Florensky's definition, the concept of the icon can be transferred and superimposed upon the role of music in a liturgical context. As a result, Oestvolskaja's music works as a sonic icon and is essentially an inclusion of an established method of providing this window to God. Orthodox practice includes numerous other rituals and traditions throughout any ceremony. The overriding concept in Orthodox practice is that if the ritual and traditions are preserved, then the theology will also remain intact. In Orthodox theology, ritual also heightens the profundity of an activity, whilst repetition imprints the given words that accompany the ritual in the believer's mind. It must be restated that Ustvolskaja's music was not liturgical. Had she even wished for her music to function liturgically, there would have been little chance of this, given the political situation of 20th century Russia, and the fact that instrumental music has never been permitted in the Orthodox Church service. Never mind that many of her subtitles for her compositions were taken from the Western Catholic Church, the Benedictus qui Venit and the Dies Irae, for instance. Yet the performance of her music in a secular setting does not transform its function from sacred to secular. Her music retains its spiritual subject without its performance in a religious setting. It is thus appropriate to assess the role of the narrator in Ustvolskaja's Symphony No. 2. The male narrator, again dressed ambiguously in black, which is further indicative of ritual itself, is instructed to cry out in a primitive scream. The narrator here is symbolic of all mankind, crying out in the darkness of a blackened stage in an unarticulated howl to God. The feature of this primitive and somewhat barbaric exclamation, repeated and coupled with the dramatic staging required, escapes the contemporary world and delves into a timeless metaphor for the depths into which humankind has plunged, invoking a quasi-ritualistic encounter as performance experience. Although the cry does not feature in Symphony No. 3, Apocalypse is no further from reality, as the instruments adopt the same sinister force. The apotheosis inferred in the previous symphony is this time replaced by Oestvolskaja's dramatic implementation of solo percussion. Such ceremonial aspects appear in works of other composers. The Danse des Adolescents at the beginning of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring palpably prophesies Oestvolskaja's timeless pulsations with irregular accents. Although Stravinsky does not here quote liturgical chant directly, even the most esoteric levels of The Rite of Spring are manipulated by folk material. The entire subject matter of this work is, of course, a pagan ritual concerning the sacrifice of a young maiden who, only through dancing herself to death, can inaugurate spring. The irregular recurrence of quaver beats in grand duet is palpably redolent of The Rite of Spring, invoking similar ideas of primitive ritualism as it combines metric and ametric rhythms, manipulating the subjective expectation of the listener. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov spoke of his affinity with ritualistic paganism in the context of his overtly religious Easter Sunday overture. Despite his extensive explanation as to the ecclesiastical origins of the melodic and semantic content, he continues by aligning Christian rituals with pagan rituals, describing it as combined reminiscences of the ancient prophecy of the gospel narrative, and also a general picture of the Easter service with its pagan merrymaking. Rimsky-Korsakov furthers this comparison by directly measuring both the Orthodox oral and visual spectaculars up against pagan activity. Surely the Russian Orthodox chime is instrumental dance music of the church. Does not the waving beards of priests, sextons clad in white vestments and surplices, transport the imagination to pagan times? The obsessive crotchet pulse evokes far more sinister images than the simplicity initially projected. The low, dark crotchet beats of the double basses in composition No. 2, for example, are redolent of a funeral march, assimilating pertinently with the composition's Latin subtitle, Dies Irae. Oestvolskaja's instrumental use of wooden box continues with this somber notion, as its crotchet pulsation suggests nails being knocked into a coffin. This incurs further significance due to Marlov's claim that it was originally Oestvolskaja's intention to use a coffin for this percussive technique. It was only her dissatisfaction with its timbral qualities that inspired her to specify the measurement for wooden box. The directions to make this box are included in the score and allude to the significance of carpentry in Christianity. The banging of nails into a coffin can also be interpreted as a reference to the execution of Christ. The inexorability of her rhythmic constructs even reflect the unstoppable metronome broadcast to St. Petersburgian civilians during the Leningrad blockade. The constant beating evident in so many of Oestvolskaja's works induce these same notions of humanitarian survival. So the ritualistic ideas behind Oestvolskaja's music impose a direct influence upon the musical language she employs. Wordless shouts, aggressive rhythmic pulsations, uncontrolled dissonances, religious symbolism, specific spatial directions all comprise Oestvolskaja's ritualistic musical language. The spiritual implications of Oestvolskaja's rites cannot be ignored. Their reference to pagan rites, as well as ceremonial aspects of Orthodoxy, adhere to Oestvolskaja's outlook that there is no one true religion that is free from corruption. It is with this overriding spiritual proclivity in mind that the semantic value of Oestvolskaja's appropriation of musical material from the Russian Orthodox Church's ancient chant, the Znameni Raspiev, is relayed. The long and complex history of the Znameni chant adopts augmented significance when the influences that altered the original Byzantine chant that came to Russia during its conversion to Christianity to make it uniquely Russian are reflected. Maxim Brajnikov addresses this complex and antiquated process. Quote, Znameny chant was in the long past derived from Byzantium, but no sooner on Russian soil than it encountered an entirely new medium. The musical perception of the Russian people, its whole culture and custom, and thus began its second life in Russia. Indeed, it is both significant and wholly unique to Russian culture that many Russian folk songs are so similar to the melodic lines of church music, reinforcing Rimsky-Korsakov and Stravinsky's ideas that were mentioned earlier. Although Oestvolskaja refused to acknowledge this influence through her lifetime, evidence of characteristics of the chant are constantly flagrant in each of her profoundly spiritual works, without exception. However, in light of her refusal to confirm publicly that this was a resounding influence, the extent to which this inclusion was entirely intentional is ambiguous. When her former student Bachmann, for example, dared to address this subject with Ustvolskaya, asking whether she borrowed any system of notation or melodic development from the chant, she answered that she had arrived at her system differently. But what we can be sure of, however, is the personal context and artistic climate from which Ustvolskaya's music sprang. Oestvolskaja had received a rigorous musical education from her childhood, where she would have been made aware of links with Russia's musical past. Furthermore, Nikolai Uspensky, an ethnomusicologist and grandson of one of Russia's old believers who have kept the chant in their communities, was on affable terms with Oestvolskaja, holding a teaching post at the very same conservatory in which she worked, providing access to his numerous anthologies of Russian liturgical melodies. In addition to this flourishing practice, the Khrushchev thaw of the 1970s saw a sudden increase in the popularity of the compositional approach, of including aspects of the Znameny Raspiev, as Uspensky's collection of transcribed Znameny melodies was published. This was the first time Soviet composers had gained access to such an overtly religious publication, and it thus was an appropriate time for Oestvolskaja to instigate further exploration of such traditions. Added to which, Yuri Butsko's polyphonic concerto, with an exhaustive explanation of his inclusion of the chant in a lengthy preface, was made available to the public. Schnitger's hymns from 1974 to 1979 soon followed, implementing the very same compositional approach. The reasons behind Oestvolskaja's inclusion of aspects of Znameny Raspiev are both numerous and diverse, and need to be elucidated before any analysis of her musical material. A brief overview of the history of the Znameny Raspiev and its current position in Russian culture initiates such an investigation. The reforms from the earliest part of the 17th century devastated the practice of liturgical chanting and consequently altered Orthodox Church practice permanently. Yet communities of the Old Believers have always refused to accept any reform to the Znameny chant, and still today stalwartly remain true to the ancient chant repertory, providing a hugely valuable resource to any such investigation. Many of these Old Believers died as a consequence of the ruptures that occurred in the Orthodox Church, and thus the preservation of the chant has assumed an uncompromising purpose as it has been handed down from generation to generation. As the Old Believers' historical and social role as nonconformists who have preserved the chant alongside its liturgical practice for centuries is considered, it appears apt that Oestvolskaja would seize the Znameny Raspiev as a musical symbol of political and religious dissidence. It is also necessary to briefly refer to the extent to which Znameny chant was already infused in the Russian music canon. Oestvolskaja's deep knowledge of the work of Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, Rachmaninoff, and particularly Shostakovich would undoubtedly have brought her into contact with these ancient melodies, even without having directly accessed the Old Believers' communities herself. I propose that Oestvolskaja's final attraction to the Znameny Raspiev was the vast musical possibilities it presented. The chant, free from a rigid structure, offered dissonant harmonies, some microtonality, exotic modes, and metric freedom. Essentially a modernist musical vocabulary, that departed from Oestvolskaja's Russian masters before her and enabled her to progress creatively while staying true to her Russian heritage. Let's just have a listen to the chant. Here's a short example. Melody is the text, and likewise in Oestvolskaja's music, the text and sounds are never considered separate entities. For instance, in Oestvolskaja's Symphony No. 3, Jesus Messiah Save Us, there is no pitch notated for the narrator, yet a rhythmic inference is stated, the text syllabically set, denying the performer of complete autonomy. In keeping with typical characteristics of the Znamení Razbiev, Oestvolskaja includes no fewer than 5 general pauses in her composition No. 2. These pauses provide the narrator with a similar syllabic freedom demanded from a cantor in the Znamení tradition, providing the musical line relief from strict metric pulsation and endowing the music with a palpable sense of time. Despite the apparent absence of structural symmetry in Znamení Razbiev, there are very relevant architectural rules that are given in any given canticle that provide contrast and variety as the melody is created by passing through various types of trichord. According to Smolensky's analysis of the chant, the compass of the chant can be contrasted and varied by subtle exploitation and alternation of the outlined trichords, causing configurations of tone and semitones in short motifs to be a typical characteristic of Znamení Razbiev. In Znamení chant, it is typically characteristic for melodies to be diatonic, habitually proceeding in conjunct melodic movement and advancing mainly in stepwise movement. As much of Oestvolskaja's work, the main melodic lines also progress in stepwise movement, it is not surprising that her work is littered with intervals of tones and semitones. Yet Smolensky's findings become increasingly remarkable as the trichord theories can be identified in Oestvolskaja's more complex and certainly angular motifs. For example, the clusters found in the oboes, double basses and tubas at the opening of Symphony No. 3 can easily be reduced to the trichords, as you can see, as can the whole tone scale starting in bar 4 at the double bass line. But Oestvolskaja augments these tonal relationships through the introduction of a changing texture later in bar 43. The oboes can be taken as an example. Each oboe is designated a minor third interval upon which to oscillate. As the minor third itself is a manipulation of the trichords in question, it consists of a tone and a semitone, a horizontal of these appearance of these trichords occurs. Simultaneously, however, a vertical implementation also occurs as the 5 soloists play in parallel with each other. So at the same time the minor thirds are established as a horizontal melody, the vertical relationship between the 5 oboes at the starting note of each line is also ascertained. According to Taruskin, specific arrangements of these trichords result in a manifestation of noteworthy scales. This is wholly significant, as Oestvolskaja's music is inundated with relevant examples of the appearance of these scales. The octatonic scale is never more prevalent, for example, than at the beginning of Piano Sonata No. 5, where the melody meanders around the mid-range of the piano in stepwise movement. Clear examples of the diatonic scale can also be found, for instance, in the very opening of Piano Prelude No. 3, the second voice in the right hand immediately toys with the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th degrees of the diatonic ascending, before launching into an almost complete version of the descending Russian minor scale. Stravinsky also uses these scales extensively. It is hugely significant that this passage from Les Noces that Taruskin chose to analyse in terms of these scales is unmistakably indebted to this preliminary sketch of the Znamení melody. It's figure 50 from Les Noces. I don't think we've got time to play it. This direct Znamení quotation removes any vestige of doubt about Stravinsky's intentions regarding his implementation of trichords and scales. In turn, we can ascertain that Ustvolskaya adopted the same compositional technique to fulfill an identical purpose. Russian composers of the 19th century, without an historic Russian tradition of Western art music, were compelled to discern a way to combine these distinctly Russian traditions with the contemporary practice that had been established in the remainder of Europe. Mussorgsky was clearly inspired by the notion of reconciling the Znamení Raspiev and Western genres. For example, in his opera Hovenshyna, direct quotations of the Znamení chant can be found with new harmonies, prophesying the declamatory manner that Ustvolskaya would command from her narrators. Tchaikovsky included Znamení melodies in many of his secular works, including his Sixth Symphony and the Queen of Spades, and Rimsky-Korsakov composed his Russian Easter Festival overture based largely on the Obichod, including several biblical examples in the score itself. Rachmaninoff's liturgy for St. John Chrysostom was ensued by his all-night vigil, where he drew upon several Orthodox chants, including Znamení, to compose a cycle of 15 liturgical settings for choir. Similarly, Stravinsky included direct Znamení melody tradition in his Russian church choruses, and the soprano line of the Otche Nash is freely based on the traditional Znamení melody for the Lord's Prayer. Schnittke was also to allude to the Znamení Raspiev in his film score Day Stars, whose subject concerned the life of Ivan the Terrible, reverberating with Prokofiev's quasi-Znamení inclusions for Eisenstein's infamous version. Counter-similarities can be made between Ustvolskaya's music and the Orthodox traditions. Znamení texts dictate the rhythm and form according to the measure of speech patterns, as do Ustvolskaya's text. The earliest forms of monodic Russian chant were expressed in a staffless notation, proceeded without syncopation, and never included a time signature, hugely redolent of Ustvolskaya's refusal to embrace convention or restricting notations such as bar lines. But a final inquiry must consider the purpose of Ustvolskaya's inclusion. The political and social situation within which Ustvolskaya was composing is of particular note, as her creative productivity was constantly observed and publicly scrutinized. Without the freedom to publish music that would overtly convey her personal spiritual convictions, Ustvolskaya was compelled to acquire a compositional approach that could release her from her artistic shackles. It is largely attributable to music's ambiguity that the Znamení chant was drawn upon as a tool for communicating clandestine spiritual and iconographical messages. Her inclusion of Znamení chant in its truest iconic form provided a route through which she could explore her spiritual fervour discreetly, without the risk of conviction. An examination of Ustvolskaya's contemporaries show a lengthy and widespread preoccupation with this approach, validating the secret code of the Znamení Raspiev, ritual, and iconography as a major factor in the analysis of 20th century Russian composers, far from the watchful eye of the Soviet Cultural Ministry. Thank you.